So an update here for the ANL 91 Worlds prototype. As you can see, I have most of the car completely assembled now. So what did I do from last time? So last time I did the rear shocks, front shocks, all the turnbuckles, steering assembly, all that stuff. So a few things to point out here. Let's say starting with the shocks. So these are associated shocks, which is pretty obvious by the gold color. Now on the pistons on the inside, he did not use associated pistons. He actually used low-C number 5 pistons on the rear and low-C number 4 pistons on the front. For the time, the low-C pistons were a perfect fit inside the associated shocks. Same, shock bore and everything. The front springs are actually cut springs. So you can kind of tell if I sort of wind this around here. You see that? The spring is cut. So I don't know what car or what particular brand of spring this is. It's a bigger bore spring, so it might be a low-C spring that was cut down to size to fit the front shock here. So that's kind of interesting. You will see here that the hex portion here on the shock that you see on the rear shock, that was shaved off on the front and sort of ground down to be nice and circular. I assume that's for aesthetics, but I don't really know why that happened. On the original 91 car, if you look closely at the pictures, the front shocks didn't have that shaved down. So this is just more, another piece of the story for how this car was changed or modified after the 91 Worlds. Okay, as for the ball cups, I did decide to go with the white ball cups because this is what came with all this stuff that I bought. If I went with black ball cups, that would have been more accurate visually, including having some of the black Traxxas captured ball ends, I think on the steering link. But I wanted to use all original parts from what I got from Chris when I got the car. I didn't want to bring in anything from outside. So I just cleaned off the white ball cups as best as I could and used those. Let's see, other little details here that are kind of interesting. If you look really closely, again, on that one image that's of any use for understanding how this car went together, you see on the front shock here, there's this little red spacer between the shock bushing and the nylon nut that mounts the screw against the tower. I had to make sure to use that there. It was not used on the rear shocks, by the way. It was only used on the front. And there's another nylon nut in front to lock everything down. Okay, fine. On the rear, this was kind of interesting. When I put this shock on and I was looking at the pictures, the screw comes in from the front side with the shock bushing, and then the nut tightens down. So you do that, and then you put this whole thing through the front side of the tower and you screw on the wing mount post. So if you wanted to work on this shock, you would have to take this whole thing apart if you wanted to freely open the shock cap. Or maybe you don't do that, you just take the wing off, take the wing nut off, and this whole thing pulls off, and then you just take the shock cap off with this whole assembly here. I thought that was kind of interesting. Let's see, what else? On the front here, for the caster blocks and steering knuckle assembly, there are a few interesting things. So this caster block here is a Kyosho Triumph caster block. So this is a spare caster block steering knuckle set I have for my own Triumph. These caster blocks and knuckles are from the Triumph. And what happened here, interestingly, is that the hole that you use to mount the inner hinge pin, this was enlarged, I believe, to suit this hinge pin, associated style hinge pin, but also he drilled another hole, a little hard to see, right there. And I don't quite know which hole was actually used in his world setup. I think it's the original hole location, just made larger, because if you use this other location, it'll widen the car a little bit, it will raise the roll center a bit, and I suppose it would work on these arms. And maybe that was actually a modification he made after the Worlds, because you will notice that on this car, even though the arm looks very similar, you have these two big holes and then this tiny hole here, which is kind of the same thing you see here, the same pattern for the cutout. This part right here, the inset to the arm, is a shallower inset than what you have here on this arm. And so probably that's where he would have used this caster block with that extra drilled hole that would have been drilled right there. Because that would be a shorter assembly that would fit inside this shorter opening. If you use this original hole right here, it wouldn't quite fit inside of this without the caster block bumping up against the arm. So even though I do have, a couple of arms here, there's only one specific set of arms that has that deeper inset that's specific to this car with, let's say, the original setup, or what I believe to be the original setup. I do have one extra front arm that's cut like this with this shallow inset, so that's meant for this, let's call it a later gen or second gen prototype car. So it's a small detail I noticed, because I had that other arm I had was pretty clean, so I figured, okay, rather than clean up another arm, I'll just mount that. And then I came to realize later that it doesn't fit right. Also, the second gen car, whatever you want to call it, it looks like maybe he started off using a modified Triumph caster block, and then he just went straight to RC10 caster blocks with RC10, spindle carriers and wheel axles and wheels. But there was this sort of interim development point where he was still using the Kyosho part. Now, another thing you'll notice is that the Triumph front wheel axle uses 4mm inner diameter bearings. And he took that off and put on what I believe to be a Traxxas wheel axle, which seems like it fits okay, but I'm not 100% sure, because this kingpin here is completely jammed. You can't pull this out, you can't push it in. I don't know if this is the original set that he used at the Worlds, or if this is like a replacement set that he had. It's hard to tell from the pictures too. But I'm going to assume that it's the original set, which means that this here, even though it's not, let's say, completely assembled, because this doesn't go all the way through to get the E-clip in on the other side, it's jammed, right? That's as far in as it'll go. On the other side, it goes in just fine, actually from the bottom up with the E-clip right here. So slightly different setup there between the left and right. I'd have to assume that with this wheel axle, maybe he had to drill out the hole that the kingpin slots through for the wheel axle in order to make that work, and that could be why it's jammed on this side. Maybe he didn't quite bore that hole out quite enough. That's just a guess. So that's another interesting little tidbit there. Let's see. I did notice again in the pictures he had these Traxxas wheel nuts, or wheel mounting nuts, or nylon nuts on the car. Now, this car did come with one of them on this side, and on the other side it just had like a standard lock nut like this. So, maybe he lost that wheel nut. So the only part I've had to pull from something else to put on this car to complete it is this little nut right here. I got it off of some Traxxas Rad 2 spare parts that I have. And it's similarly aged, because it's just as old of a part as this one. So I figured that would be okay to put on there, just to really make it look symmetric and correct. So as far as I guess you can call it a slider, as far as the slider build is concerned, it looks like this is done. The next step will be mounting the wheels and tires, the electronics, these sorts of things. I'm not completely sure if these little white nylon hub, wheel hub spacers here were part of the sort of post-Worlds development effort, or if those were actually on the wheel hubs for the 91 Worlds car. I probably just have to like check the widths and everything, because this is meant to account for some change in offset of the rims. So if you're running like a Yokomo 870 rim, that's a pretty deep offset. If you ran that with this, the car would be too wide. So I think I got to double check the measurements to see if I need to take those and put them on here. So yeah, other than that, the slider's done, and it's pretty cool to see that, you know, this is a one-of-a-kind car, and, you know, even though technically it was raced at the 91 Worlds, that car in its form at that time no longer exists, because the chassis was cut out afterwards, the top and bottom decks, the arms were modified, the shocks were modified, certain changes were made to the car. So this was really a development car. That's why it was a prototype car. So yeah, I think I've covered all of the little details that I can think of, or that I was able to dig up on this car and sort of reverse engineer. I'll probably do one or two more videos after I get like the wing mounted and other things like that. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I certainly did. This is a genuine, authentic piece of history here, so it's really nice to have it all fully restored and everything. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching.